The size of the U.S. budget is $7 trillion. It affects every part of our daily lives. Few of us know much about it, or even how it's put together. Shalanda Young knows a lot about it. She was director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Joe Biden, and before that spent 14 years putting together some of the most complicated budgets in history. Director Young joins us to tell us how the budget process works, how it should work, and how DOGE may be a distraction to a larger concern. Let's swear into the People's Cabinet, Shalanda Young. Director Young.
Hi, Dan.
Welcome to the People's Cabinet. So when you were growing up in Louisiana, did you one day have dreams of a $7 trillion budget to oversee?
Let's see. I came from a town of when I started the Appropriations Committee, the staff director said, "How big is this town you always talk about?" And I was like, I don't know, like 10,000 people. And I went and looked it up. It was less than 2,000 and shrinking. So it was such a delta. I had to go back to him and correct the record. And he's like, that explains a lot about you. So no.
So tell me about how you got from there to overseeing, one of the largest budgets in the entire world. You were a presidential management fellow. You served and worked with the House Committee on Appropriations, and then eventually became Office of Management and Budget Director. Take me through your career.
Well, the Presidential Management Fellows Program, when I started, was the Presidential Management Intern Program. The name changed while I was there because it was really fellow encompassed, like people with graduate degrees. It was a big deal to get into this program, which I didn't know. Like, ignorance is bliss. My career is probably summed up with that phrase, ignorance is bliss. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to go in some of these rooms, just this bravado that comes with being young. Youth is wasted on the young, not in that sense, because you knock on doors that you didn't know existed. I loved civics class in high school, loved it. It was my favorite class. We took it in 10th grade, American history in 11th. I remember it was such my class, the teacher picked me to lead the class. They could pick students for one day, like it's your class. So that was mine. I could tell you I never heard about the Appropriations Committee. I never heard about the Office of Management and Budget. So I came to D.C. and listened.
And how did you hear about the internship program?
I went into my dean's office and there was a brochure and I was like, can you all sign this so I can apply to this? Ignorance is bliss, a lot of prayer from my grandmother, mother, and just remembering this life lesson they taught me as a kid, you're better than nobody, but nobody's better than you. And I always tell young people, 5-10-year plan, you don't know anything. Why would you have a plan that's immovable? You go, you listen, you learn. And that's how I found the Appropriations Committee. They would call the National Institutes of Health when I was a Presidential Management Fellow. And I'm like, who are these people? They call and the whole place stops. They're afraid of them. I need to know who they are and I want to be them. And that's kind of my career. I listened and followed what I was good at.
And so tell me about getting to D.C. Had you been there before when you started as an intern? What was that like for you?
Yeah, I kind of location targeted for work. My best friend was at law school at GW. I visited her. We went out. I was like, that place is phenomenal. And also familiar faces. She was there. A bunch of people from home were there. A lot of them lived in Prince George's County. So, targeting location, to me, it was just as efficient a job-seeking tool as being I will work for the government. But working for the government probably was in my DNA too. My mom worked for the city of Baton Rouge, retired from there. My grandmother was a public school teacher. So it's kind of ingrained in you, you don't even know it.
So tell me about the Committee on Appropriations. You said you had never heard of it. I think most people in this country still haven't heard of it. So if you could explain what it is and what a staff director is.
Yeah, it is the committee that determines what government programs get funding. Now, their sphere of influence is decreasing because what they control is decreasing. It used to be in the 60s, 2/3 of the budget were decided by the Appropriations Committee. That has now flipped. They are barely hanging on to 1/3 of the budget. So when people hear about shutdowns, that's because the appropriations process has failed. But that doesn't mean things like Social Security, Medicare, those are handled by other committees. They're in the mandatory or entitlement space. So the Appropriations Committee deals with about 1/3 of the budget, but critical parts, everything like Head Start, everything in the National Institutes of Health, cancer research, child care block grants, so what states get to help promote accessible and affordable child care. So critical things are funded. The whole Defense Department, they barely have anything that's not controlled by the appropriations process. So still very important, even though now controls less than 30% of what we spend in this country.
And then as staff director, what was your role?
Knowing where all of it was. I'd probably worked on half of the subcommittees. The Appropriations Committee divides itself by parts of the government. I'd worked on about half of those before the first chairwoman, by the way, to ever chair the Appropriations Committee. She picked me to be her staff director, so I got to work with the first woman to do that, and she just recently passed away. So she's been on my mind a lot, and we could do with a lot more Nita Loeys in this town. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Her mantra always like in the back of my head. And that's kind of how I frame my career, trying to find places where Democrats and Republicans can meet. And staff director meant we had to cut deals. Democrats often promoted the social programs that were found in the bill that funds the Health and Human Services Department, the Labor Department, the Education Department. And often we had to work with Republicans on a lot of the national security needs. That didn't mean Democrats didn't support national security, but often we had to find deals that took care of both sides' needs.
Well, take me through a deal that you think is illustrative of the kind of work that you did, maybe just a specific example that would help our listeners understand.
Yeah, I mean, the big one I worked on was the debt ceiling deal, and that was when I was at the Office of Management and Budget. And obviously, working for a president to have Republicans say, hey, we're not going to lift the debt, which would have meant the full faith and credit of the United States.
Can you explain to people what the debt ceiling is?
From a political term, it is a way for one party to hold the other hostage and say, hey, I may not do this thing that's just a basic part of governing. Look, you hear a lot in D.C. about debt and deficits, and we got to get it under control. You often hear that from the Republican side of the aisle.
And explain to people what that specifically means. They say we're running a deficit. What does that mean?
But when you get to a debt ceiling vote, that's not the time to have that debate. That debate should be had every time you pass a funding bill, whenever you want to raise, let's say, tax cuts or pass a tax cut bill by $5 trillion. That puts us further into the hole. If our debt is $34 trillion now and Republicans go on to pass tax cuts that total $5 trillion, guess what? Take 34, add 5, and add anything we spend between that to the debt. It's an accumulation of our spending and also what we choose not to bring into the government via revenue. And both those decisions, revenues decisions, so taxes, spending decisions, they're all now adding to the national debt. When we talk about deficits, that's just a yearly term. Debts is a cumulative term.
So it essentially is you have a certain amount of revenue coming into the government, and that revenue is oftentimes exceeded by the obligations that we have. Is that a fair way to characterize?
That is a fair way to talk about it. But the 2023 debt ceiling, I would say, debt ceiling has been used as a cudgel to get spending cuts or have revenue changes or this dialogue in D.C. In my view, it is a terrible political tool to use if you even threaten as Congress not to pay our bills, pay our obligations that basically Congress is 5 years before decided we should spend or have tax bills that add to the deficit. Then you are risking, I think the conservative estimate was 8 million jobs in this country. So to use that as a way to bring people to a conversation that you can have any day of the week, it's a really dangerous game to play in this town. So there are a lot of us who don't believe Congress should be deciding this every time you hit a debt limit. The Constitution says we should pay our bills. Congress has given itself the responsibility to lift the debt ceiling, but there are lots of ways to fix that, and there have been ideas on legislation to take Congress out of that role if we're going to continue to possibly cause a default and not pay our bills if Congress doesn't act one day.
And so it essentially means, Congress obligates a certain amount of spending. Sometimes the well, oftentimes the revenues do not exceed the amount that is spending, and there's a certain amount of limit of the debt that that Congress obligates for that, and when we exceed that, we need to raise the amount. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the system we've set up.
Okay.
One could also set up a system that says a president has the authority to pay its bills, as the Constitution suggested, and if Congress wants to opine on that, they can do that after the fact. Now we have a system that puts Congress in the middle of this process, which seems about as basic governing as one can get. Do we pay our bills as a country? Do we pay bondholders? Do we pay Social Security recipients? Even flirting with that. We've never breached that, but I'm worried about the political climate in this country. Are we getting closer and closer to doing that? And it concerns me.
And how often is the debt ceiling, how often does the United States need to raise its debt ceiling?
Depends on how much you spend or provide tax cuts that take more out of the Treasury. This is an accounting or this is based on decisions Congress is making every day. Again, if Congress wants to opine on spending or how much the government should bring in by tax code or tax policy, then have that debate. Have that debate before you vote on a tax bill. Have that debate when you vote on an appropriations bill. By the time you get the debt limit, that's because you made decisions, you chose not to have a fulsome debate and think about the debt when you pass those other bills. And it's just political. It is used in campaign ads. And one just has to ask themselves, is that what we want our government to do? To have this incredibly powerful tool that could thrust this country and the rest of the world, frankly, into a recession like we've never seen before? I don't think so. Congress has lots of opportunity to talk about spending and taxes.
And I think part of the challenge for our listeners and people who are watching around the country is that they see it on TV, they see a lot of drama, but I'm not sure they fully understand what would happen if we did not raise the debt ceiling. Can you talk a little bit about the implications?
So one, I think we have to get our debt and deficits under control. But I would love to talk about that when we talk about passing a tax bill that would add, the Congressional Budget Office, if you extrapolate out, says we could add $37 trillion to the debt over 10 years if that reconciliation bill is passed. Let's talk about that. You almost hear no conversation about the debt and deficit from the majority in Congress, from Republicans in Congress. But I promise you this, when that bill comes due and the government debts are adding up in 4 or 5 years because of that tax bill, then all of a sudden people are going to find religion. Oh, what happened? I can tell you what happened. Here's this bill here. We had that in the 27 tax law. They didn't pay for themselves. They added to the debt. And if we don't lift the debt ceiling, we keep this system where we allow people to use it for political theater and have this conversation that they refuse to have when they pass the laws that added to the problem, we are basically in a cash-in, cash-out situation. Can you imagine the government like, let me see what kind of cash I brought in yesterday to see what bills I can pay today. Let me see if I can pay that Social Security check for maybe A through Z. We don't know how to do that. So I can't tell you how bad it is, but I can tell you as someone who has been in government, we don't know how to do a cash in, cash out, managed by the day system. And we cannot promise people who rely on Social Security and Medicare that we can keep their services or the money that they paid into all their lives. No one can promise them that because we've never had to prioritize payments in this country based on our receipts from the day or two before.
And when there's a lot of conversation around negotiations around the debt ceiling, people say defaulting on the debt. What does that mean?
It's the same as defaulting on your credit card. You don't pay your bills. And guess what? The United States has a credit rating just like people have a credit score. And it's counterintuitive. So people were worried about the debt threatening to default. you make our credit worse, meaning it's more expensive for the United States to borrow money. Make it make sense. It doesn't.
Meaning similar to the way if you have a lower credit score, your
You miss a
interest rate,
payment,
your
your
loan is going
interest
to be
rates
higher,
go up. That's
and more
exactly
expensive to
right.
rent a house. Got it. So debt ceiling is one aspect of this. I'd love for you to take a step back and just talk us through a typical budget process, the way it should work and the way it works in reality.
Don't make me talk about the way it should work, because it does not resemble that at all.
Okay.
People old enough to remember that video, I'm a Bill, where the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, then you go to conference, then the president signs it or doesn't. That's how it's supposed to work. I have not been to a conference meeting where the Senate and House sit down, hash out its differences, since the first Trump administration trying to find a deal out of the longest shutdown. We reopened for 2 weeks to try to find a deal, and thankfully that worked, and we had a traditional conference meeting. But even that was a bastardized process. Like, that was like a Hail Mary trying to...
But in the Hail Mary scenario, what does that look like? What's like a high level of what it should be?
It should be the House has a bill, even the appropriations process. The House should pass all 12 of them. The Senate should pass all 12 of them.
And you don't have to go through all 12, but what does that mean, all 12?
That means the appropriations process is divided into 12 bills. So one bill funds the Defense Department, one bill funds the Energy Department, one bill funds the Labor and Health and Human Services and Education departments. Each of those should be passed individually. Because a big complaint you'll hear from rank and file members is, hey, my leadership makes me vote for this thing. With this thing, and they know we don't like this thing, so quit combining them. So regular order really should be each of the 12, so members and their constituents have transparency about what they're voting for. They don't want to get blamed for voting for a policy they hate in the defense bill if they're really voting because they really love this new initiative in the bill that funds the health department. So each of the bodies, the House and the Senate, should pass each 12 individually. Frankly, they make up the 12. If they wanted 18, they could have 18. If they wanted 6, they could have 6. The point is, like, stratify them as much as possible into buckets that make sense and that are related. And then they should come together. And then they should have conference, so negotiated bills on each one of those, work out the differences between the House and the Senate, and they should be done by October 1st. That, you want to know the last time that happened?
No.
Seriously.
I can
You
only
look younger
guess.
than me, and
Yeah.
I was in high school.
Okay.
It was in 1994.
Okay. And so each of the 12 come up with their budgets. Who then is responsible, and is that the committee, to then add it all up and say, okay, we got a problem, or this works, or who?
So I was staff director.
Yeah.
So the chairwoman and the staff director, they assign allocations. We know what the top line is. The budget committee has given us a top line. That process is broken as well. Budget resolutions don't happen
Yep.
in regular order. The only reason you see the budget committees doing stuff now for the Republican budget reconciliation is because it has to use this arcane budget process reconciliation. And the only reason they're using budget reconciliation is because they know they only need a simple majority to pass it.
Yep.
They could not get Democrats to cut Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act in order to pass tax cuts. So in order to do this process, you're hearing a lot about the budget committee. That's only because it's a necessity. And if you look at the document, it provides as little framework as possible. You really won't see the details until the other committees like Ways and Means and Finance take the direction from the budget committee and put it into reality. In a regular process, forget reconciliation, just your yearly job, both parties have stopped doing it.
And reconciliation means what?
It means that years ago...
And as layman's terms, as the listeners can understand.
It's a budget. Like, take the word reconciliation out. It just means the differences have to be reconciled by both bodies. But they're even trying to find a way around that. So I tell people, think it's a budget. It's telling people what your priorities are. It is, you're sitting at the budget committee and you're giving other committees with jurisdiction over programs directions. So that's what it is. It's a budget document with directions, targets, if you will, and it tells the committees who actually control those programs the targets they have to hit.
And I just want to make sure I understand what actions constitute something that falls under reconciliation versus something else?
Usually spending and tax policy.
And give me an example of like a disagreement that would fall under reconciliation.
So I wouldn't say a disagreement, but like a tax policy, if one wants the corporate tax rate or what corporations pay in this country to go from 21% to 15%, they can do that through reconciliation. You also
and who talks to who? What's the process?
Usually, reconciliations are usually done when one party controls both. They see it as their opportunity now that they have a process, or 51 senators, Republicans or Democrats. They will often use reconciliation now. That was not the case always. Before, there were bipartisan bills done through reconciliation. But the 2017 tax law, Republicans controlled the House and the Senate. But they did not have 60 votes in the Senate, so they used reconciliation and passed it on party line. Democrats passed the rescue plan, the bill to help bring COVID under control after Joe Biden was elected president under reconciliation. Had over 50 senators in the Democratic Party, but not 60. The Inflation Reduction Act, same. And that's why you see this being done for this tax cut bill that's percolating.
And is that just a procedural thing? They just say this is under reconciliation? Like, how do they determine that?
Well, you have to set a course. You go, I don't have 60 members.
Yep.
I have to do this under reconciliation. You send your budget chairs out to do the work. Like, let's see what we can get done under reconciliation. And the Senate parliamentarian has a large role in deciding what complies with budget law and what is out of order or out of scope under that process.
And the parliamentarian, I know this name comes up every time this happens, is essentially the referee who makes that call?
She's almost bigger than the referee. a referee is like, on the edges, like other people can't raise their hand and ask the referee to decide if you're in a game. Like the referee has to see something. This is, they're going to this person arguing in this tax bill, like Democrats arguing why something is out of scope or why something doesn't fit under a section of the budget law, and Republicans are arguing if they want something to happen, why, including precedent-setting things, why that should be allowed to happen.
So there's been a lot of conversation anytime there's a budget, and there's a lot of conversation today recently, and we'll get to DOGE as well. I'm sure you're thrilled to talk about that one, about mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually means in layman's terms?
Mandatory funding tends to give a longer period of certainty in their funding, and the appropriations process is yearly. So one is argued yearly, one is argued every 3 years.
Yearly is the discretionary budget.
That's right.
Okay, and so we've talked a lot about the process, and then you get to a point where you're getting close to October. People are having these conversations. They may or not be getting to a point in which there's a vote. If there is not a vote, what are the typical paths? And there's a lot of the abbreviation CR talked a lot about, continuing resolution. I believe that's what does that mean? And what typically happens when you don't hit that October 1st deadline?
I mean, Congress has failed to do its job.
And that happens a lot.
That happens a lot. We're under a long-term continuing resolution now, meaning the Congress took last year's bills and continued them with some changes. They'll make some changes around the edges, but it's really not using the last best and information we have from agencies about what real needs are. Pell Grants, a school year. I have different enrollment data every year. If you don't update that program is not going to keep up with who we thought we were going to serve. That's like one example of what you would fix and update in an appropriations bill that doesn't potentially get fixed or updated in a continuing resolution. So you're a student who got one last year. I hope the data suggests fewer students are in, or you may not get a Pell Grant that next year unless Congress fixes it. And a continuing resolution has just very few fixes. The whole idea is like you do very little. Like if Congress can't pass full appropriations bills, continuing resolutions are supposed to be the bare minimum.
And is the money you get out of a CR static, like in terms of like if it's a dollar, you get $1 for a program in fiscal year 2024?
Congress can do whatever it wants. So a continuing resolution I tell people, you hear politicians say, I will only vote for a clean CR. Clean's in the eye of the beholder. They all have something, unless they're just changing a date. And I've rarely seen CRs that just change a date. They tend to have changes in them. Like something so bad, if I don't fix that, it's going to break. So they tend to do that. But it's probably 1% of update compared to what an actual appropriations bill would do. So most things don't get fixed, don't get updated. The real breakage points are what get fixed in a continuing resolution, and that's not much.
And then can you CR forever?
There are bills to what I think would lead to CRs forever. Their drafters would not say that, and I'm adamantly opposed to them. They say, like, if Congress can't get his act together by October 1st, we'll have automatic CRs. Well, Jesus, then we'll have CRs forever. Remember I talked about budget resolutions? We used to pass them. We stopped passing them because people were like, oh, I don't have to do that? Well, why would I want to take a tough vote? That's what's going to happen under automatic CRs. No, Congress doesn't always get it together. But what they don't need is fewer opportunities to have to talk and negotiate and get stuff done in a bipartisan basis. Automatic CRs, fewer must-pass pieces of legislation. I'm not defending them at all. It ain't pretty. It doesn't work. We shouldn't have threats of shutdown. I think what is worse for the institution, for this country, is allowing them not to have to deal with each other. And bills that allow that, I think, are problematic.
And so if there is no CR, and there's a vote to decide whether there is a continuing resolution, is that correct? Then the government shuts down. Is that correct?
You say potato, I say potato. Most people will say shut down.
And what does that mean in practice?
But remember, we talked earlier, appropriations is barely a third of what we spend. So those programs in the appropriations process stop being able to spend. We call it
so remind us, the other 2/3 are what?
The other 2/3 are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
That don't get affected
those
in the
continue.
scenario.
But guess what? The people who manage those programs, so don't have a problem with your Social Security benefits. You either can't find someone, or the person you find is not collecting a paycheck. Air traffic controllers is a great example. They stop getting paid. They go to work. Administrations have a lot of flexibility of who they can say, hey, you're not getting paid, but you got to go work. And what you find is a lot of government officials live paycheck to paycheck. And if you're on week 2, you miss a first check, you start to get a lot of call outs. You start to see a lot of uptick in gig economy. So if I need to go out and drive Uber to make rent or mortgage, then even though I was told, like, this service doesn't stop, these people are essential, you do start to find a wear on the system as shutdowns, or as the technical term, a lapse in appropriation happens. So they're not great. But they're on a different scale than what we talked about earlier, default on the debt. Shutdowns economically are minuscule compared to what most economists believe a default would be. So I always like to remind people, 2 bad things, 2 that could shut down government programs, but in very different ways. The other one, full faith and credit, if we don't pass a debt ceiling left, I can't really tell you what government services look like, because remember, we're counting money on one day and trying to decide what we're paying on the next day. On a shutdown, we've had them so many times, we know for a short one, Social Security checks go out, air traffic controllers show up to work, TSA agents show up. The longer you get, the more problems you start to see with services.
I think that's really important to emphasize, that the debt ceiling and defaulting on the debt is just a gravely different scenario.
And it's grave. It's just grave.
And so, okay, you've seen this process happen over and over again in times in which Democrats, it's a split House and Senate. You've seen it when a party controls both houses and the presidency. When does it work? And how do you see, what is a template that people should try to aspire to?
People ask me a lot. I've never worked on a campaign. or on the political side. That doesn't mean when you work in these jobs you don't have a political brain, because you do. You need to count votes. You need to know when you negotiate or do a deal.
And this is actually, if you could answer this in the context of the work you did on the debt ceiling,
Yeah.
which many people at the time thought there was no path. There was a lot of cynicism whether something could get done.
That's right. And we didn't close the loop on like a negotiation. Like
Yeah.
that was that one. I will say, and I just did an event with Patrick McHenry, who was one of the Republican negotiators in the room. And you have to have two sides who understand the gravity of not coming to a deal. We were lucky enough to have that, which meant the other stuff was working out details. Like, there's almost no chance of success if the leaders, President Biden for me, Speaker McCarthy for Republicans, don't understand the gravity of impasse. And I worry that we're getting past people who understand the gravity of that, but thankfully we had that. And to me, that means I get to do the easy part, come up with a deal that Democrats could vote for. So I go back to, like, I've not worked on the campaign or political side, but you have to have a political brain when you're doing these deals, because if you want Democrats or Republicans to vote for it, their negotiators need to know what the market will bear as you're, like, developing these policies. Like on debt ceiling, our ultimate goal was to avoid impasse.
And in that case, you felt, despite the disagreements, that essentially there was a consensus that we will not default and we will
Correct,
figure
and
this
you
out.
had to understand what the impasse was. In my view, Speaker McCarthy had a political problem of his own. That's in my view, what we were solving for. The debt had to be lifted. If Congress is not going to change the law to take itself out of that role, then their role is clear. They had to lift the debt ceiling. That's why before we negotiated, you saw many officials, including the president, say, we're not negotiating on this, guys. This is your job. What is there to negotiate? You love this country and you don't want to see all these people out of work, or not? And I tell people all the time, part of your job when you're negotiating these deals is understanding the other side's problem. He had a problem. Remember, the speaker had gone through, 15 rounds? Budget deals often are what get Republican leaders in trouble in the House. I'd seen it over and over and over. There's this great picture of John Boehner, like, falling into the elevator, eyes closed, as the beginnings of the Freedom Caucus wanted him to shut down. So you have to know what the other side's problem is. I don't think Speaker McCarthy wanted to default. He needed, and he had a lot of his caucus who were like, you got to get something for it. And we could not ignore that reality. We wanted to ignore that because this was, this was just part of what your job is if you're in Congress. But I can keep saying that till the cows come home. He had a problem in his conference, and it was now our problem because it stood in the way of lifting the debt limit. So we entered into talks.
And what do you think was the thing that you were able to help address for him to get him to yes on it?
I think everyone's expectations, because it had been done during the Obama administration with negotiations between that president and the Capitol Hill, was there had to be some budget caps on the appropriations process. And I tell people all the time, I was like, my favorite thing about that deal was it was 2 years and not 10. The Obama years, it was a 10-year budget deal. This time is a 2-year budget deal, mostly flat. That most Democrats could live with if the deal was honored, which, DOGE is not honoring that deal or appropriations law, if you ask me, and ask a lot of judges, in my view. And Republicans really wanted something on work requirements. We were able to do something that Democrats didn't want to touch at all, but the Congressional Budget Office said the changes we made would probably add more people to SNAP, food assistance, than drop. My big thing, too, always is all members have, at the end of the day, are their votes. When you do these deals, you represent your entire conference or caucus. And when we went to explain this deal, because part of your job in negotiation is also like understanding and explaining what you have done in that room, was not to sell people. We shouldn't have been there. The debt should have been lifted. So one, acknowledging that, but two, reminding people anything we did, here was the starting point Republicans wanted to do. The problem trouble they get themselves in is they go off and do this thing without constant check-in, or at least knowing the people who have to vote for them what they need. I had a member who just cried. She had been on SNAP. I knew that about her. I wasn't about to tell her, but we'll add more than we lose. None of it was acceptable to her. I understood that. I was sorry we had to touch that at all. But Republicans had leverage when they passed a bill on their own. And leverage is king in this town. And their bill had much worse work requirements, which meant we had to talk to them because they control one house, and also they passed something on their own, which gave them a lot of momentum.
You mentioned DOGE. You brought it up. And so I want to ask you about it. On the campaign trail, Elon Musk would say very proudly next to President Trump, we're going to cut $2 trillion. It's a thing that I want to do, and I think I can do it. Can you just talk to listeners in general about $2 trillion in cuts, what that could potentially mean, as well as in general, what is your evaluation of how DOGE has proceeded?
Look, I could cut $2 trillion if I didn't have to talk to Congress. I didn't know that was an option. Like, honestly, I have jokingly tell people, I was like, half of me is like offended and horrified, and half is jealous. It was like, I didn't know this was an option. I didn't know bypassing Congress and doing spending without the legislative branch was okay. But to go back to the half that's offended and horrified, you talked about the $7 trillion. To do $2 trillion, you cannot do it with the appropriations process we just talked about. Depending on the year, $1.4 trillion about. So if you want to cut all of NIH, all of Head Start, all of the Defense Department, all of the Energy Department, education, that's fine. It doesn't get you the two. So where are we going? We're going to Medicaid, we're going to Medicare, we're going to Social Security. That's why you hear DOGE, Elon Musk now talking about those things. You can't hit those numbers without dealing with entitlements.
If you had a magic wand and you looked at the budget, what would you want to cut?
Here is the thing. Probably because I worked in Congress for about 15 years, this is, I'm more sad for the breakdown of Article 1. So Congress's will to push back on this than I'm about anything.
Say more about Article 1.
There was this member, David Dreyer from California, Republican, one of the smartest members I've ever met. He used to go around telling people, we're not just equal, we were the first. The founding fathers chose to mention the check on the executive branch. So I'm a very different OMB director in as much, I argued internally. You can do executive orders. We can do a lot of stuff in-house. Guess what's lasting? Getting Congress and working with Congress, convincing them to pass a law that is a lot harder to overturn than doing stuff yourself. So my magic wand would, as far as cutting, would be one, to detail to Congress and have them act on it. And we did in the Biden administration. We act like spending is only like when families get help from the government. We do a lot of subsidies to oil and gas in this country in the billions, in the tens of billions. Pharmaceutical companies get a lot of money from the American taxpayer. I don't think most Americans would be surprised to know we pay 10 times what other countries pay if the government buys a drug, if they're on Medicare. We can stop those things through laws. Those are the kinds of things that bring in big money to the federal government if we stop them. And we've got to change the narrative that the only thing worth cutting and saving, the only thing we can save money through is the stuff that helps families in this country. It's peanuts compared to our debt problem. and it cuts the knees off from people who are the engine drivers to this country. So you either believe one thing, you help the big guy out, and it like finds its way down to like somebody, like most people in my family, or you help middle class families, working families, give them some tools, give them some critical investments like affordable childcare. Imagine a mom gets a Head Start slot and she can go back to work half or full time. That grows the economy. I'd rather do that than give oil and gas companies more subsidies.
Can you give a sense of the scale of those subsidies?
Yeah, that one was about $30 billion. If you're looking at pharmaceutical negotiation prices, that could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars if we could bring down pharmaceutical costs through our Medicare program. That starts to add up to real savings. And by the way, our revenue policy should not be taken off the table. People talk about Clinton and surpluses. Guess what? We had about 19.5% in taxes as a percentage of GDP. We're around 17% now. So asking those at the very top to pay more into the system so I don't have to cut something or disability payments for people who are barely making it, I think that's worth the exchange.
So in this reality of Congress that is dominated and controlled by President Trump and Elon to an extent, what do you think the future is of DOGE?
Look, DOGE, I don't care about DOGE. I think we have to not be so uber focused on one person. This administration has embraced DOGE, embraced Elon Musk with open arms. DOGE, whether Elon Musk is there or not, or that organization by that term, will be carried on by my old agency and the leadership of that agency with vigor. They have decided the law that stops them from doing this and holding money hostage is unconstitutional, so they're breaking the law there. So I'm very careful not to think about this as the institution everyone's talking about right now. My worry is the whole enterprise is focused on this undoing of government. But for what reason? We should all be happy to sit in a room and find efficiencies and things that don't work. But for the good of the American people needs to be the next clause in that sentence. That's the part that's infuriating. It's being done. If I could tell you why it's being done, I'd feel better at night. But there seems to be no rhyme or reason why certain things are being done, because this goal of everything being in service of Americans and the working people, that seems to be missing.
And so in this podcast, we like to talk about the alternate vision, and you mentioned some of the programs that you think are particularly impactful. Can you talk about some of the programs that you came across your desk that didn't get the funding you probably thought it should, that would make a difference for families, or just some programs that people may not know that you think would be impactful?
One thing I've toyed around with and what we don't do is look at programs for their impact on growth in this country. Like, what gets people out of the door into jobs or into better jobs? Like, what assistance? The one thing I keep coming back to is childcare, affordable, high impact childcare. I have a 3-year-old myself, and it's unreal. It is unreal what childcare costs in this country, and a lot of people have chosen, like, why would I pay for my kid? I make less money than to send them to childcare. And this idea, Republicans have done it on the tax side. They like to talk about dynamic scoring. So they want to say, cutting taxes for this corporation isn't really that amount. That's not really coming out of the Treasury, because we're going to look at this in a wholesome view. We're going to say that corporation will now invest in other things, and that should be a part of what they cost. We don't do that well on the spending side, and I think we should. We should pull away from those things that might be these one-time things that don't add anything other than like money going out. But I think about things like infrastructure. If I can build a high-speed rail line and someone that goes back and forth to New York, like how much more efficient can people be getting from A to B in this country? And we're behind other countries. Like, what are we losing because we don't have infrastructure in this country to have people get from A to B and be able to work but somewhere else, but live in the communities they're from or that are more affordable. There are some people like Yale Budget Lab, being led by one of the people who used to work at OMB with me, Danny Yeagan. How do we look at spending from this holistic standpoint? The flip side of that is we don't do as much spending in the things that don't add big impact to this growth in economy. Look, Congress is not perfect. Some of the things we fund are things because one member finds a lot of value in them. And we have to have the tools to push back with data. Like, if I can spend here, that gets me nothing compared to if I can invest in Head Start and look at all the growth that happens if I can get 10,000 more slots for that program. We need the data to be able to show like why our spending choices aren't having as big of an impact and why we should start pulling back from some other things.
Yeah, I always find it ironic that, especially private sector ROI, return on investment, is such a big thing. We make investments. R&D is a significant, research and development is a significant part of a private sector budget because they know that they make that investment and there's going to be a return on it. People do it all the time when they're trading in the markets, but yet when it comes to a budget, it's like, oh, that's wasteful. We can't spend that much money on it. But for every dollar you spend on something, there's a significant return, like you say with childcare.
Well, we knew that about IRS, and we saw Republicans still cut that.
Yeah.
Conservatively, what you put in for enforcement, you got back 2-1. Most people think it's much higher than that, closer to 10-1. So we don't want to make these decisions. Like, politics gets in the way. The reason company A, B, and C can do that is because their board is laser focused. Your job is to get shareholders more money. Like, politics muddles everything here. That's why people are like, if it was a business, I was like, it ain't. Like, think about it. You're in the White House, you're in OMB. I had 535 board members, and they don't all have the same goal to help shareholders out, the American people. They got different, like 500 ideas on how to do this. So it's like, I cringe a little when people are like, oh, it's like a business. I was like, you come here and see, like, the businesses don't have this level of politics and decisions in them. But also get it. If you are a member who spent 30 years and you finally get to hold a gavel and you've been watching this program send stuff to urban areas and you're from a rural area, you never got it, guess what? You start your own program that focuses on rural. Then people look, wow, we got 10 programs for this. It's like, well, proliferate it. And God help you if you try to cut one. I had a chair one time, was like, can you please, we had a real conference meeting where two sides came together. He was like, can you please bring back one elimination of a program? It's like, sir, I will try. And I got one.
So we've had a long conversation about the intricacies of the budget. I think listeners have learned a lot about things that maybe they didn't know or probably were afraid to ask. But there's a lot of disaffected people, especially after the last election. People are disengaged. They hear a lot of acronyms. They hear a lot of excuses coming out of D.C. So despite all of that, despite how disenchanted so many people feel, or people who have switched parties or what have you, what's the one piece of advice or message you'd give to a listener to take to his or her community right now that would help get people back engaged?
I mean, I think this country has had that problem for a long time. I went to Ghana, and they were so disappointed. They only had 61% participation in their presidential election. I go, what? I, in my lifetime, never saw numbers reach that level. And so, we shouldn't fool ourselves. This trend of pulling back from the system, not thinking it doesn't work for you. I think Donald Trump has mastered the way to talk about that. But Democrats felt that too. we wouldn't have had an equity agenda if we thought the government worked for everybody the same. It's who do people trust to ensure the government works for them and isn't like selling them a bill of goods. And I'm a big believer, like, if you think this is awful, which I do, not just the rule of law piece, but like what is going to happen to the American people when you see this tariff agenda like fully realized, when you see prices going up, not down. When you see that, it's just really has to, like, it is the person, the party who is able to speak it with authenticity to people who are hurting. And this just isn't a new thing. I don't want to sit here and people think we're defending some institutions that, many of us got into the government to try to make sure they worked for people like them when they grew up. I'm one of those. And I think a lot of the things they're hearing now, like, I get the attraction to it. So I never want to be someone who's like, yeah, how you feel now? Like, how's that turning out? Because that turns people off. Like, I don't want people to hear Democrats and think, like, we are a turnoff for them because we're worried about this person and not them. I almost think our problem as Democrats is like we care so much and we can't like really even fully tell you how much we love you and what we've done for you. And we've got to speak like regular people, have ideas, be ideas based, not attack each other like moderates, progressives, moderates, oh, it's all progressive. I don't believe that. I probably fall somewhere in the center. And wherever you are in the party, we want to see ideas come forward of how you would have a government that worked for everyone. I'm from that little town. I can promise you that town, Clinton, Louisiana, is one of those that were left behind. And I can tell you, working for Joe Biden, when we talked about equity, we meant Clinton. And I don't think people heard that. They heard, you care about somebody, not me. And that's not true. And I'm as much a rural person as I am black, as I'm a woman. And how can we say that with that authentic tone that people will listen to us and come back and know they're welcome? This is a party that gives a shit about people from all walks of life. And somehow that has just gotten lost and they think we're focused on everybody but them. And that doesn't mean just white people. Black people think that too. Hispanic people think that too. We lost people from every walk of life. How do we explain the aim here? And I hope we spend a lot of time looking forward and talking about those ideas and trying to speak to people with that authentic voice than we do of trying to beat each other up over who's responsible for 2024. It's a thing parties have to do after they got beat like we got beat. But this forward ideas look is what I'm interested in doing and trying to think through spending. Like, what makes sense? A lot of rebuilding is going to happen. Things aren't going to look like they used to look. That's an opportunity. We're going to have speak with an optimistic voice about what is set for the future and not turn people off from the process. Because in my pessimistic voice is that's what some people want. They want to just do this shock and awe to turn people off from the system. And we've got to figure out a way to keep people engaged.
Shalanda Young, thank you for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.